today we'll be talking about Thomas Paine, and I spent the last few days trying to put together the information, the things I want to talk about, and I can't. I really there's in every page in his writing,
Hmm.
every thought is opens up a Pandora's box of ideas and ruminations and histories, if you will.
Hmm.
But in doing, we got to start somewhere, and I wanted to start with something from Gordon Wood's
Okay.
book, Revolutionary Characters. What made the founders different? And I like this particular book because, in my opinion, very few people, at least the way it's my perception anyway, that Thomas Paine is not considered like a one of the essential founders of the American of the United States. Somehow he is a
Hmm.
it's a very enigmatic character in the
Hmm.
cast of America, of within the cast of the founders, if you will. And
And
I
yet, as you were just saying,
yes,
you've been reading him, and the prose is alive. What he's saying speaks to you 250 years later.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I especially for my lifelong my perspectives on matters and on
Hmm.
my sort of my passions, my biases, if you
Hmm.
will. I mean, he just addresses. He
Hmm.
seems to be speaking to me right now. He is
Hmm.
so modern.
Hmm.
He's probably more than maybe he's postmodern, if
Yeah.
you will, in so many ways. And I tried when I tried to think of his place among the founders of the United States.
Mm.
I kind of I could the only analogy I could come up with is Che Guevara. He is deeply associated with the Cuban Revolution,
Mm.
but he's not
Hmm.
Cuban.
Hmm.
And
Right.
he
Yeah.
also had an impact on other revolutions in Latin America.
Hmm. Hmm.
He is the kind of roving messiah, if you will,
Hmm.
revolutionary who supports all kinds of
Hmm.
progressive and revolutionary ideas wherever they may be, as in some ways happened to Thomas Paine because he also had a role to play in France. And yeah, so I'm going to start, and I know you have so much to say about him. So I'm going to start with something that Gordon Wood mentioned in his book, Revolutionary Characters. He says his biographer of Tom Paine, the Englishman John Keane,
Hmm.
in his biography, Tom Paine: A Political Life, calls Paine the greatest public figure of his generation. And somewhere else he says, not only is Paine's bold rejection of tyranny and injustice as far reaching as that of his 19th century successor, but his practical proposals are actually more radical than Marx's,
Hmm.
mainly because they manage to combine breathtaking vision, a humble respect for ordinary folk, and a sober recognition of the complexity of human affairs. And okay,
Yeah.
what do you think?
That's, I think, pretty accurate. I think Paine has been really favored by radicals since then. I was just thinking of Howard Fast, 20th century Marxist novelist, wrote a biography of him. Eric Foner, distinguished historian, also from a radical background, have written biographies of Paine. And yet he does have this way of connecting with ordinary folks, not the way, Marxists are big on theory, seeing the
Yeah.
world as abstractions. Certainly Che Guevara and the Cuban Revolution did see these abstractions as opposed to the people in front of them. But Paine never loses sight of the people in front, which is one reason why he falls afoul of the French Revolution. He winds up being imprisoned in France because the revolution has gone further to the left, and it's only after Robespierre is out that Paine is released from prison. But yeah, he's causing trouble. Seeing him as the greatest figure of his generation, I don't know. That's something we could discuss, but certainly he has that passion, and it's an unlikely thing. You think when he arrives in America, he had left a failed marriage, a couple of kids in England. He had a number of jobs. He'd been a corset maker, an excise tax collector, and in fact, one of his first writings was a petition for the relief of excise tax collectors in England. This is before he gets a letter of introduction from Franklin and heads off to America. And then he starts working for writing for a magazine. As he discovers this talent he has for writing and putting things in such a clear way, as you say, that they still speak to us 250 years later in a way that, say, John Dickinson or even Jefferson and Adams don't necessarily.
Yeah, I want to stay with Gordon Wood a little bit in his book. And he also says The Rights of Man, one of Tom Paine's book, is the best and most succinct expression of American revolutionary political thinking ever written.
That could be. And the irony, of course, it's written about the French Revolution. It's a defense of the right of the
Yes.
people of France to throw off the monarchy. And it's in response to Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, which may be one of the best conservative documents about you can't just replace something with nothing. What will happen is chaos, anarchy, and ultimately tyranny, which is what happens in France. But Paine writes this defense of the right of the people of France, or any people, to throw off their government and change it, which is something. No, and by the way, that phrase, the rights of man, he coins it, and he and Lafayette write their the rights of man, which become central to the French Revolution. And then Mary Wollstonecraft picks that up and writes the vindication of the rights of women. So from Paine, and that's not something Paine would dispute, that is, this idea of human freedom is so central to what he is saying that, so even though he's writing in France, it's a vindication of the American Revolution and the cause of America, which he does see as the cause of the whole world.
Yeah. Yes. And I want to quote also one of your favorite historians and mentors and professors, Bernard Bailins.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote an essay called Jefferson and the Ambiguities of Freedom.
Mm-hmm.
At one point in 1993, and I'm quoting: "The clear voice the clear voice of America's revolutionary ideology, its purest conscience, its most brilliant expositor, its true poet, who wanted to, quote, extend to other regions of the earth the sacred fire of freedom and self-government." And so it's kind of like, these kinds of comments would kind of open the door to the discussion of common sense,
right?
Which is a sort of declaration avant la lettre, which in some ways, so many people believed. I found a Richard Henry Lee. In 1776, he wrote, he said he moved that Congress adopt common sense as the basis for the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. And it's difficult to overstate how important common sense was to this, because if an American had written this tract, by the way, he writes it in December of 1775, so 250 years ago now, he is writing this. He had written a number of other pieces for this magazine in Pennsylvania. And then he is asked by Benjamin Rush to do this, make the case for independence. And he doesn't start with all of the grievances, what's happened since 1765, and how the Crown, the British Parliament, remember, had been the big target because Parliament was overstepping. Paine demolishes that. The cause isn't the Parliament versus the colonies. It's the cause of everyone to govern themselves. And the monarchy itself is the problem, he says. And it's really a striking thing, a riveting thing. If this were published today and as many people bought copies today, it would be on the New York Times bestseller list. That this is a pamphlet that circulates. There are like 10,000 copies, 30,000 copies before January is over that are being printed, turned out, and everyone is reading this, all across the political spectrum. And Paine is making this new argument for independence, which had kind of been suggested, hinted at. There are people like John Adams who were for it, Patrick Henry, but making this the cause is really what Paine does, and saying we have it in our power to begin the world over again. This is a new start, not just for Americans, these beleaguered people on the coast of North America, but about how freedom has been pursued, hunted throughout the globe. She's been driven out of Africa, exterminated in Asia, and now driven into exile from Europe. So it's the responsibility of America to form a haven for this fugitive. and this fugitive of freedom. And so
Yes.
it's really, and then making the argument for why, the argument both why monarchy is a bad thing and why a continent shouldn't be governed by a distant island, but then making this into an argument generally so that anyone can read this and say, well, this actually also applies to me. Because there's nowhere in the world where people have this power to govern themselves, which Paine is securing for the Americans. And then talks about this mystical idea of kings. He calls them the crowned ruffians of Europe, how they get power. And we've developed this kind of mystical idea about the monarch who will hold the nation together. He says, no, the law will be king here. So the law is something else that will hold us together. So it's such a striking thing. And by the way, John Adams isn't really happy with it because a lot of people thought he wrote it. He was the one people most associated with independence. And then he thinks Paine's whole idea about how to form a new government, he thinks is crazy. The idea you simply have an assembly. Since we've done away with the king, why do we need to have a separate house for aristocrats, a House of Lords? Just have one assembly. And everyone will be able to vote for the assembly. And everything will go along swimmingly once we've gotten rid of these checks on what the people want. It's really a bracing pamphlet to read. And it's one of the few pamphlets from this time that we can read today and understand it because he's writing for ordinary people in a way that none of the other founders could have done. And that is really the striking thing about Common Sense. By the way, it's published under the name Common Sense because no one knew who Thomas Paine was. And the point wasn't here, Thomas Paine is telling us this is just common sense. And that's really his great talent, is stating what should be obvious.
Yeah. Hey, you mentioned John Adams. In one of the biographies of Thomas Paine by Craig Nelson, he quote John Adams describing him as a man with genius in his eyes. I mean, talking about Thomas Paine. And he wrote to Jefferson, John Adams. Is saying that history is to ascribe the American Revolution to Thomas Paine. And yet we know that at some point, John Adams also says at some point that he is a star of disaster.
Yeah. Well, often when Adams says history is going to ascribe things to someone else, it means they're not ascribing it to me, and so he thinks that's unfair. He also said that the story of our revolution will be one continued lie from beginning to end. They'll say that Franklin smote the earth with his stick, and out popped Washington, and then Franklin electrified him, brought him to life, and then the two of them did everything. And so Adams worries, I think, that history will ascribe it to Thomas Paine. And when people start thinking he wrote Common Sense, this is when Adams writes a couple of pamphlets on thoughts on government. He agrees on independence, but not the way to construct a government. But he sees Paine's importance, disagrees with them on some things. And other people, by the way, are answering Paine, trying to refute common sense. But just think about what a task that is, refuting something that is common sense. But it is what turns the public consciousness toward independence as something that's not only achievable. And Paine says, the resources of America will be able to do this, but also necessary. You're never going to do anything unless you declare independence. You're not going to get the crown to agree to let you govern yourselves, but remain part. No, we're not going to remain part of an empire. We're going to form a new world.
Yeah, and he redefines common sense. It's a very good point you make. He redefines common sense as like anti-status quo. Very often, when people mention the word common sense nowadays, or maybe throughout history, the assumption is we need to be reasonable and adapt to the social structures and the status quo. And for him, common sense is quite the opposite.
It is, yeah, because we're going to continue having these problems with this distant government unless we break free. We're not going to be able to engage in trade with anyone else as long as Parliament can govern our trade. And Parliament does that because of the king. So, the common sense for Paine is this complete break with what is here, instead of, hey, let's learn to adapt and maybe we'll get a better ministry in power. Remember, in 1774, there was an election for the Parliament, and the thought was maybe if the opposition wins, they'll lighten up. And Paine just says, you don't put your faith in this kind of thing. You have to, again, form your own country in order to do this. And you're doing this not just to benefit you, but to benefit everyone, to be this example to the world.
I mean, I'm going to speak occasionally randomly here. Where did he get? I am one of the things that is fascinating to me, especially in light of the fact when he was writing part one of the Age of Reason in France, he was quoting from the Bible. He was citing the Bible,
Yeah,
both Old and New Testaments, without having any,
that's right.
without even looking. Yes,
Yeah. And then you
and
see
so
parts 2 and 3, he is actually quoting it because then he has a copy of the Bible. But he,
yes,
so he is a voracious reader and would have, as most educated people, and he's not as well educated, he's not from the British aristocracy. He's kind of a middle class guy, but the Bible would have been the foundation of reading. Everyone has read the Bible. If a family has one book, it would be a Bible. And clearly Thomas Paine had studied it. And and he also had read enough political theory to understand it, but wasn't so bogged down in it that he was mired in the details of what Montesquieu said or what Vattel or other of the writers said. He kind of could get the point, but with the Bible, he really has a textual understanding of it, which is really quite phenomenal. In that first part of the Age of Reason, he says the only parts that actually have this idea of the greatness of God are, the 19th Psalm and the book of Job. And the
yeah.
rest of it, he says, is pernicious or simply nonsense. Yeah. So, but he does understand it in a way. Clearly, he has read it many times but he's also able to write in such a free way that he carries us along with this.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds as if he is one of the most emblematic figures of the Enlightenment, and yet there is not a. I mean, we can't find any trace of a very rigorous classical
No,
education he had
no,
in England.
that's true. Yeah, yeah. And he says he doesn't read Greek or Latin. What's the point of reading these
Yes, what's
ancient
the point?
languages? Yeah,
Yes,
he said the only reason people had learned Greek was that was a language of science because he
yes,
talks about the Christian era
yes.
debasing science and smothering science, and so we have to go back to the Greeks. But now everything's been translated, so why not? So study living languages.
And the other thing that's fascinating is when he wrote Common Sense, he addressed the pamphlet to the inhabitants of America. And when he wrote The Age of Reason, he addressed it to my fellow citizens of the United States of America. So
Yeah,
28 years later, he
yeah,
is now, it's a different, it's an amazing two moments in history. One before the revolution, and then 28 years later, he
mhm,
was writing now about a bigger topic to him,
right.
which is uh, the, the ultimate sort of the, if you will, extension of the revolutionary ideas he preached in 1776.
Right, right. And he's writing again in France about
Yes.
the French Revolution, but he's addressing it to the people of the United States who are
Yeah.
beginning to divide about what they think about the French Revolution. And Edmund Burke's pamphlet is kind of seminal in this. And it gets him into another dispute with John Adams, because John Adams was worried about the course the French Revolution was taking, that the French were demolishing the only system of government. And it's reflective of something you see in the first couple of paragraphs of Common Sense, where he says that society in every case is a blessing, but government at
Hmm.
its best is a necessary evil.
Hmm.
And Burke was saying in his pamphlet that governments have to reflect the social structure, and the French are abolishing not only the government but the social structure. They're not replacing it with anything, and that's going to lead to anarchy. And then, since power abhors a vacuum, there will be a military dictatorship. And John Adams was saying much the same thing, and he was writing a series of essays on a civil war that happened in France in the 15th century. And there's an Italian historian named Davila who had written about this. So Adams starts writing his discourses on Davila, which start appearing in the Philadelphia newspaper until people say, wait a minute, this is criticizing the French Revolution. The French are our allies. They're in favor of the rights of man. So are we. So let's abolish let's smash the printing presses so they can't print this. They only start reprinting Adams's discourses on Davila after the rights of man comes out. So this is one of these curious things. So Paine vindicating the rights of man, and then shortly after that, he decides it's time to refute Christianity. This idea of an established religion, and it's not the central idea of it. He says he believes in one God, a creator, but he
Yes.
thinks everything else is this accretion that's been used for different people to seek power and hold power. So that's really his major argument in this, just as his argument in Common Sense had been about power. And so it is in the Age of Reason, and refuting this. I suspect because Christianity was the religious denomination he knew the most about. This was his target. I suspect if he lived in any other society that had an established religion which was used to support those in power, he would be refuting it. That he does talk about Moses, he talks about Muhammad, he talks about these other creators of systems which were meant to oppress rather than to free the human mind.
Yeah, I was kind of struck by something he says in the Age of Reason. As he opens the first part, he says, "I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life." He says, "I believe the equality of man. I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy." That kind of reminds me a little bit of Winthrop.
It does, exactly. When he says in the city upon a hill, to do justly, to love mercy, to
Yes.
walk humbly with our God. Yeah, exactly. That is the central thing. I was struck by that passage too, and how much it evokes that Winthrop city upon a hill, that idea. But Winthrop saw religious duties being much more than simply trying to do good to fellow men. I mean, you're doing that for the purpose of um, uh, glorifying
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, I mean it's a secular version, but it's the principles and
Yeah,
the
yeah,
motivating principles are the same. So
exactly.
even though there's a huge departure, let's say theologically, so to
Mhm.
speak, from John Winthrop's worldview, but the idea,
Yeah,
the notions of virtue, this
yeah, yeah.
they have a similar notion of virtue.
Exactly. Yeah. And
Of good.
Jefferson, yeah, and Jefferson wrote a little book, The Moral Teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And Paine says much the
Yes,
same thing about Jesus's message is one that would be very much consistent with this. So Jefferson thinks if you simply took out from the New Testament what
exactly.
Jesus said as his moral teachings, that's a really good system of ethics.
Yeah,
Paine makes the case. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
I had to go to the very same passage. He says here uh, about Jesus Christ, he preached most excellent morality, unlike Moses and Muhammad, by the way.
yeah, yeah.
Because he is a different, he preached most excellent morality and the equality of man, but he preached also against the corruptions and avarice of the Jewish priests and everything else. So
Yeah,
he was a revolutionary.
that's
And
right.
so,
Yeah.
in this sense, he was the absolute. And I noted and said, see Jefferson. I mean, it's
Yeah,
exactly the same
exactly.
idea
Yeah,
Jefferson
yeah,
ended up
yeah,
doing later
yeah,
on when he was
yeah.
president, right?
That's very true. And he extracts Jesus's teaching, saying everything else. And Paine makes the same case here that we don't know who actually wrote the Gospels, or who wrote the epistles of that are attributed to Paul and so on. But we do have these things that Jesus said as part of his teaching, which is a very small part of Jesus's life. He lives for about 30 plus years, and we only have about 18 months recorded of that during his ministry. So he takes Jefferson takes these teachings, and this is actually a good system of morality, and seeing the rest, in much the way Paine does, as a system created really to bolster the power of the state, saying, well, God is, the revelations have given us this power to use over you. So it's a refutation of some. I was also thinking of Jefferson's last letter written in June of 1826, when he's declining an invitation to go to Washington to celebrate the 50th anniversary. He says, all eyes are opening to the rights of man. And he talks about the power of the state and monkish superstition, which have kept people subdued. So it's really an attack on the human systems that have been created, using the book, the Bible, as a way of bolstering the power of those who will want to exercise power over others.
Yeah, to stay with this connection with Jefferson, who is going to be our topic in our next episode, he says, unlike Moses and Muhammad, uh, because Moses and Muhammad were founders of different systems of religion, but Jesus Christ founded no new system. He called man to the practice of moral virtues and the belief of one God. The great trait in his character is philanthropy.
Yeah,
It's a very interesting
it really is.
statement, and yes, and here in yeah, so I think there is a kind of I mean he's almost like justifying also at some point in the second part one of the Age of Reason. He talks about the emergence of the Protestant revolution against
Hmm.
the Catholic Church,
Yeah.
and because the Catholic Church was in the business of sending pardons, dispensations, and
Hmm.
indulgences. And I think I think it's very interesting that he doesn't. He's a deist. He's a deist,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
obviously.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And he says that the Bible and Christianity is was more atheist than anything, because it is separating
Yes,
people from this idea of God, from
yes,
the one God.
yes,
And so you have all
yes,
these accretions, which in many ways that's what Jesus was coming to refute, the various very narrow laws that had emerged instead of the great law, which is to, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the two. And Jesus says, on those two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So Paine saying that Jesus' real thing was philanthropy. Today we think of philanthropy as someone like you who's able to give thousands, millions of dollars away. That's a philanthropist. But instead, it's a love of man. It's a love of your brother, as opposed to the generosity we think about at the end of the year. So that's really what Paine is seeing, trying to strip away these structures, much the way he sees the Protestant Reformation having done, with the Catholic Church having become a big, powerful entity. But then again, I know you have lots of other things you wanted to say. So, before I jump in and keep talking,
no. So I mean, again, we is he? Do you think he got in trouble and he was l'enfant terrible of the American Revolution because she said publicly what people like Franklin and Jefferson couldn't say?
probably. I mean, this pamphlet doesn't win him many friends. He also
Yes.
writes a letter. He'd been kept in prison in France, and he doesn't think that the American government did enough to get him out. By the way, he takes this pamphlet that he started writing and gives it to Joel Barlow, who's the American minister to France, also a poet, writer. He thinks it'll be safer in his hands than with Paine in prison. Um, but yeah, he also writes, after he gets out, he's kind of bitter that the American government didn't do enough to get him out. So he writes an attack on George Washington, saying, he really wasn't a very good general. Which,
Yeah.
so you criticize Christianity and you criticize George Washington, and so this is
Yes.
Jefferson brings him back when Jefferson becomes president, brings him back, gives him a pension, and he dies in some obscurity. And then, of course, his body after his death is lost. William Cobbett,
Yes.
who is an English journalist who had been in America in the 1790s and one of the fiercest in attacking Jefferson as well as Thomas Paine, Cobbett has gone back to England, and now he is taking on the establishment. And he, in the 18 teens and 20s, sees Paine as a hero. So he wants to have his body brought back to England, and Paine's body is lost at sea, which in some ways is appropriate, that the spirit is still roving the earth of Thomas Paine. But yeah, he's attacked Washington and Christianity. Theodore Roosevelt refers to Paine as that filthy little atheist, 100 years after Paine's death. So it takes a while, for Paine to be somewhat rehabilitated. And it is because of his message and the fact that he is always speaking to this idea that we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And this is the
Yes.
duty of Americans, not just for themselves, but for everyone in the world. And it's his message really is to people all over the world to, rise up and throw off tyranny.
Yeah, he's a universalist. I mean, that's
Yeah,
absolutely clear. I mean, in common sense, the he begins by saying, "The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind."
yeah,
Exactly the kind of idea that would be inserted in the Declaration of
right,
Independence. I mean, it's
exactly. Yeah,
almost verbatim. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
amazing, and many, so uh, it talks about lovers of mankind and so again and again it's an appeal. It's not just an American revolution, it's a revolution that will spearhead or will spark an
Right.
entire global revolution,
Yes.
a
Yeah.
new order. I mean, what is it called, a new order for the ages, so to speak.
That's right.
Virgil,
Yeah.
the idea from
That's right.
Virgil, it's
Yeah.
now coming true.
That's right. That's right. That's why we have that on our dollar bill, the Novus Ordo
Yeah.
Seclorum. So, yeah, yeah, yeah. And so it really is. So seeing it in a much different way than just, Parliament's been taxing us. It's not that; it is something else, and making it why this is essential. And then, I have to say, at the end of 1776, things are going very badly for the American cause. Washington had left New York with about 30,000 men. By the time they get to the Delaware River, they're about 3,000. And Paine is one of the few who joins the army at this time. And in fact, Fort Lee is a fort on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, where actually Fort Lee, New Jersey is today. And the British took that. And one of the British officers said, "We didn't find much except some trash by common sense." Paine had been writing and he fled with the rest of the army. But then he writes, the crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier
Yes.
and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of men and women. Uh, and he talks about, it says, tyranny like hell is not easily conquered. And so
Yeah.
this is a difficult time. In the summer, things have been going well. Now it's the winter, and this is really when we need to stand fast. And he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of men and women, not just us, but everyone. And he talks about in Perth Amboy going by an innkeeper who's standing at the fence. And he said, with as pretty a child as I'd ever seen. And this man says, talking about the trouble, says, "Well, give me peace in my day." And he says, what kind of a father is this? He knows that independence is going to come. He knows there's going to be war. It should come in his day so that his child can have peace. And that's really what Paine is talking about. It's not just us, it's the next generations. It's a reminder of this. And that is really what makes him so striking, is that he's able in this darkest moment to write this. By tradition, Washington has this read to his troops before they go across the Delaware to attack Trenton, reminding them what the stakes are in all of this.
And also, but just as a parenthetically, he also mentioned asylum twice.
Yes,
Describes it just like Jean Gonde Crèvecoeur did in his
yes,
book,
yes, yeah,
Letters from the
yeah,
American Farmer.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I thought that's a very interesting connection there as well. Yeah, in Common Sense, he says the sun never shined on a cause of greater worth.
right,
And
yeah,
it's just
yeah,
it's again once a beautiful
yeah,
passage. This is not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, of at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. It's not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity are virtually involved in the contest, and that's just
yeah, yeah. Just beautiful prose, isn't it? It's,
yes.
yeah,
And also he says we should make this declaration. I mean, we should be an open and determined declaration of independence. We should use the word declaration of
right, yeah,
independence,
yes, yes,
and
yeah,
uh, and then it should be a kind of manifesto also to be dispatched to foreign courts,
yeah,
which is again the first passage, the first line in the Declaration of Independence. The
yeah,
first
yeah.
message is that
Yeah,
we
decent
appeal
respect
to
for
mankind.
the feelings
Yes,
of mankind. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So
It made
seeing
me,
this,
it made me think. I mean, I'm sorry, Bob. It made me think this is it's not history proper, but I'm trying to. If there's, I should go to some sort of, Oxford dictionary, or some kind of dictionary to see where when the word independence actually was used in this sense. because I remember Bernard Lewis in one of his books, in the Arab and Muslim world, there were all kinds of movements of independence in the 20th century, and they have adopted a vocabulary that came to them from the West. The word independence never existed in the Arabic
Interesting.
vocabulary. So,
Interesting.
so I mean, I wonder how, when it started being used in the English language in the sense that Thomas Paine is using it.
That's interesting. Well, we'll have to go to the Oxford English Dictionary and see if
Yes,
Samuel Johnson's dictionary mentions this. Is there a word in Arabic for independence?
is Istiqlal. The word in Arabic is Istiqlal, which means independence. As one of the oldest parties in Morocco is Al Istiqlal Party, which is named after independence. So this notion of independence, I think, when we come to the Declaration of Independence, I'm sure we're going to be talking about the impact of that document as well. But these are notions that seem to me strikingly new in the modern political thinking or theory.
Yeah.
Because I can't recall another instance in the Middle Ages or some time before when people use the word independence in the sense that is being used here.
That's
I don't know.
a very, very interesting point, because they hadn't really been clear what it was they were seeking. And so, is this a new word? And of course, the opposite is dependence. That is, you depend on someone else. It's not connection. It's not being part of an empire. I mean, the idea, a commonwealth was a relatively small thing. And of course, in the 19th century, England begins, after it has an empire, begins creating this idea of the Commonwealth of Nations, something that would have been anathema at this time. I mean, the post Commonwealth, 17th century Commonwealth monarchs didn't want anyone talking about starting commonwealths. But yeah, so what is it we are creating? And then each of the states is going to have to create its own system. Again, Paine doesn't have the sentimental attachment to states that people here did. But again, states are where the first governments are being created. And Pennsylvania creates one of the first state constitutions really modeled on what Paine writes in Common Sense, having a simple legislature and every man over the age of 21 can vote, who pays at least a shilling in taxes, or if you don't and your father does, you get to vote. So the widest suffrage, widest voter rolls of anywhere in the world, really. And then anything the legislature does is subject to approval by the voters. So the laws won't take effect until there's been another election. And the rotation in office and other things. And there is an executive council, but that's mainly there to execute things, to do what the legislature has directed them to do. And the presiding officer of the council is a president. Now, of course, one difficulty we have in studying this is we've had 200 years of experience under a system where there's a president who does have a great deal of power. The president in Pennsylvania has very little. And here, this experiment, it's the most democratic system any state created in Pennsylvania. And John Adams thought they were headed for disaster with it, and ultimately they change it. But thinking that basically people are good, they'll get along, and they'll just do things for the common good. Adams disputes that. But then the problem really is, I know we're talking about Thomas Paine, and I shouldn't be giving you the criticism of Paine, which if he were here, he would be able to answer all of that.
Yeah.
That people have lots of other motives. And Paine was thinking, you remove the structures that have forced them into these unnatural relationships, people will want to do good things. It's kind of what he says about doing away. One reason he writes The Age of Reason is he sees in France tearing down of the clerical establishment, but worrying what replaces it, thinking
Yes.
what replaces this establishment to kind of create morality, which it wasn't doing in France, but it still has that promise. So what replaces it? And so thinking, okay, you need this idea of reason, rational thinking with this one creator God, and our duty is to do good to one another and not to brutalize one another, which more often than not has been the human condition and the outcome of revolutions.
Yeah. Yes. And so let me ask you this question: since because of the Age of Reason, which is, he was very conscious of the fact that it would be even more revolutionary than Common Sense when he wrote it, and he was worried about consequences. He says in the beginning, right? I waited till the end of my life until
Yeah,
the
yeah,
later
yeah,
to,
yeah,
to write
yeah.
such a treatise. And so, would he consider even today that the American Revolution is still unfinished because so many people in the United States somehow associate or connect the American Revolution or the United States with the Christian faith?
I would think he'd think it was unfinished for a lot of reasons. And I don't necessarily, it's because of the association with the Christian faith. And the Christian faith itself changes a great deal. As I was reading
Yeah.
this, I was thinking about William Ellery Channing, who was a minister in Boston in the 19th century. And one of Channing's grandfather, for whom he's named, is a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And um, Channing, his father takes him to a minister, an evangelist preaching sometime in the 1790s. And this guy is just talking about the judgment of God that is going to be visited upon everyone and how the world is going to end. And because we're all sinners, and it's just this extraordinary polemic, which would not have been that unusual. And then as they're leaving, young William Ellery Channing, who's probably about 8 or 10 years old, is just in terror because the world's going to end and we're all sinners. And then his father says to some other men, "That's fine preaching." And he gets into the carriage, and all the way home, his father's just whistling. He thinks, well, wait a minute. Didn't we just hear about the judgment of God being visited upon us? And Channing begins to rethink not that there is a creator God, but this idea of God's vengeance upon us. And so what happens in the 19th century is a change from thinking of the Old Testament God who is visiting death and destruction upon sinful people into an idea of, God recognizing human imperfection and wanting people to do better. This loving God, I think, is what replaces, and Channing in many ways is responsible for that. So it's a different kind of Christianity, I think, that we see influencing American society since. Although it's important to point out, officially the United States does not have a religion, a state
Yeah.
religion. And one of the reasons for that has been the diversity of religious sects, religious denominations in the country. And we'll talk about Jefferson next week,
Yes.
but his Virginia
Yes.
statute for religious freedom, it says that the state doesn't intrude in matters of conscience, and that he says this was written for the Jew, the Christian, the Jew, the Muslim, the Hindu, and he said the heretics of all denominations. So so much of the American population will profess Christianity one way or in one form or another, but we also have Jews, Muslims, atheists, all kinds of folks living in American society. And it's, again, going back to the Jesus whom Paine would have recognized, saying, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God's." So I think he would see the failure of the American Revolution probably in a lot of other ways, and not in the fact that everyone hasn't embraced the religion of pure reason.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Lately I've been reading a little bit on a new trend in political theory called post-liberalism, and I did review a couple of books by Patrick Deneen, and he gave a talk at and I did interview him on
Mhm.
a, and I think now there's an attempt to bring back. So there's a revolt against liberal ethos or the kind of liberalism associated with the Enlightenment,
Yeah.
because it fractured, what would have been a more solid, more communitarian society, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting that that part of liberalism, which Thomas Paine and to a large extent Thomas Jefferson will talk about that, embodies, has never really taken root. I don't know
Hmm.
why. I mean.
Yeah. I don't know why either. I think Paine and Jefferson are both real rationalists, and maybe
Yes.
it's most people are not. That could be. Instead, we still respond to other impulses. So I don't know. I mean, you're much more of a philosopher than I am, and
No, but the question is, could we live by reason alone? And that's
yeah,
the
I don't think so. And I think Paine kind of gets this right, that systems of religion really are ways for to oppress people. That is, the state uses this. The state uses revelation, and we see this in Christianity. We see that in Islam. We see that in most religions, that those who are in power have this direct line, and we can justify this. And I think that's where we could live by reason alone, but we see in France that also leads to the state saying, we'll use reason, to cut off the heads of the aristocrats or anyone who disagrees with us. Or think about the 20th century revolutions, the Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, which have been, atheist in nature. So you don't need to be a theocracy in order to use these ideas against those who disagree with you.
So it would seem, again, we'll be talking about this. I'm just talking impromptu now. I'm not really planning for our future discussions. But it seems to me now, at this point, we're beginning to see how the American Revolution, shaped to some extent by notions of the Enlightenment, to some extent, is in tension with the notion of, with the kind of, with the Protestant Revolution, and
Mm-hmm.
especially the Pilgrims and how they conceived of their own world and own societies.
Yeah. And the Pilgrims and the Puritans are thinking about, we're creating this godly commonwealth, and then, but how do we know what God really wants? That's the big question. And is it what we want? I mean, that seems like the obvious thing, but then even in Massachusetts in the 1730s and 40s, where people disagreed about this. And so what do you do? Because, by the way, if you're a Catholic, you'll say, well, of course, they got away from a church hierarchy and said, well, we can just have, people deciding this on their own. Well, what's the difference between a small group of people, of faith deciding this, and one person deciding, hey, this is really what it should be? It's really a conundrum. And yes, so it's set in motion by the Pilgrims, who are setting in motion for lots of reasons that would be completely, they would think none of this comes out of what we were trying to do. They would say that the fact that you have now, 300 plus million people here isn't a sign that what we did was succeeded. It's a sign that, these people are really whacked, and they've gotten away from thinking about what God wants. And that's, I think, one of the big dilemmas. Again, it gets us far off the topic of Thomas Paine, but it's something, again, I wish he were here. He could help explain a lot of this to us.
Yeah, no, I mean, as I said, he's so modern that he absolutely he's, he could be having this conversation with us and maybe
Yeah, yeah.
correcting some of the assumptions we're making about him. Uh, what I like mostly is he's a universal. He's a universalist. I mean,
Hmm.
he is thinking of the American Revolution not just simply for the sake of the inhabitants of America. Of course, it's addressed to them, common sense, but eventually to the entire world,
Yeah,
because to liberate him from the shackles of
yeah.
tyranny.
Tyranny, ignorance, superstition. I mean, there's a long section in the Age of Reason about science and thinking
Yes,
science isn't something created; it is something there. That is, we're understanding how the world works and how the
yes,
world operates. And so, a scientist isn't actually creating something the way a creative or religious doctrine is. They're simply interpreting what is here. So yeah, and thinking of this, and in many ways, that's been certainly one of the tracks here, and but yeah, seeing this as a universal thing, which Jefferson also saw and Franklin also saw. That is, the Americans are not going to be independent because they are better people or because of a connection they may have with the Pilgrims or with the early founders. This is something that is open to anyone, and not just here. We'll see this in the early 19th century with the revolutions in South America against Spain and in other places as the Americans are feeling this role and seeing this. There's a great scene in, I think, 1825 when Lafayette is visiting the United States, makes this grand tour, and he is presented with a portrait of Washington, which he then presents to an agent from South America who will present it to Simon Bolivar. That is, so a connection of Lafayette, Washington, Bolivar as liberators. And so that we have found the liberation or the independence is generally the easier part than the establishing a system that won't be worse, which we can argue about where that has happened, but it's certainly one of the causes. And I think Paine does end his days in the United States, not thinking that this is perfect, but this is a place where he's able to do this and able to, as Jefferson said, to write and to speak what he thinks.
Yes. And since you mentioned Jefferson, this is a good place to pause and get ready for our next conversation about Thomas Jefferson, because they go together. And thank you so much. And I'll see you very shortly, very soon.
Great. Thank you, Anouar. Good to see you.